I thought what I would do just to start is just kind of set the scene a little bit with a couple of sentences about why we in the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Place programme are really excited to partner with Humanise and to support the campaign. So we're a strategic investment that works across the built environment sector to advance what we call people-centred approaches to placemaking. So not too dissimilar to Humanise, but we use slightly different language. And we've been in conversation with the team at Humanise and Heatherwick Studio for some time now. And I think the thing that really unites us is that we both share a belief in the importance, the real importance, deep importance of emotion as a function of placemaking. And also a desire to try and think beyond that, to think about how do we embed emotion and people-centred approaches within our decision-making practices. And as such, we're delighted to be supporting the summit today. And what we thought we would do in this panel with our speakers is try and complement the neuroscientific approaches. None of us are neuroscientists. But what we thought we'd try and do is consider the ways in which our research and our work shows us the relationship between emotional responses and the deep emotional relationships that we each form with the places that we care about and that matter to us. So in essence, what you're going to hear today is how our initial and immediate emotional responses that have been beautifully described earlier on in the panels lead us to form or not form durable relationships with our surroundings, and how this informs our sense of belonging to each other, our sense of attachment to the places that we care about, and how in turn this might be able to secure different kinds of positive, hopefully, socioeconomic outcomes. So that's kind of why we're here and hopefully what we can contribute to the discussion. So what we're going to do is we've got 3 questions for the panel. We're going to ask each of them in turn to engage with these 3 questions, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A and discussion after that. So that's how it'll roll from now on. So I'm going to ask the first question, which, spoiler alert, is on the slide. So I'm going to ask and come to Jim first, really, and say, from your work, can you share some thoughts on how buildings do or don't influence our feelings? Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Rebecca, and great to be here. Really interesting so far. My emotion at the moment is I'm daunted by being surrounded by professors. So I'm not a professor, and I'm feeling daunted. Anyway, to get on to that, so spaces, surfaces, materiality, all the things that the designers think about and focus on day to day, really, really important part in our experience in relation to the emotional responses that buildings evoke. But the most important thing that I see is the sense of ownership of people who are in and around those buildings. And we've touched on aspects of that, the sense of the dislocation of the public, the society at large, relative to individual buildings, neighbourhoods, etc. So what we see is that the biggest and most important factor in buildings making people feel a whole range of positive things is that they have some kind of stake, some tangible stake in how those buildings come to be. So we work across a range of settings, principally within the public sector, it has to be said, and principally in health and learning estates. And in there, what we do is we work client-side with all the range of users who will ultimately be using those buildings to understand what they need. And the designers work with them to try and turn all of those disparate and often competing needs into some kind of built expression. When that works well, what you end up with is a building which responds beautifully, and I use that word advisedly, to those needs. And when people get into those buildings to work, to visit, in whatever capacity their user form is, they feel like they belong because they have had that stake. I could talk for hours about this, but I shan't because I'm not allowed to. But that is something which comes through all of the different aspects of our work. So whether it's an individual building or working across even a settlement scale, that sense of ownership which flows through a project out and into delivery is the strongest thing that influences how people feel within those projects.
Thanks, Jim. And I'm going to come to Nicky next, which it's almost like we've rehearsed this, because you've done a lot of work on ownership and belonging and kinds of emotional responses. Do you want to share a little bit of that with us?
On? Yes, there we go. So I've been working on a project called Feeling Towns, as Rebecca said, and we were responding in that project to the way in which the Levelling Up Agenda in particular had pride in place as one of its 12 missions. If we remember those particular days of the end of the Johnson government, that's where we were. So we were responding to that, we were responding to the kind of towns agenda, and we were really asking local authorities, organisations like Historic England, who are charged with increasing pride in place, what did it mean to increase the subjective emotion? How could we do that? And there was a kind of graph of things that people felt proud of. So they felt proud of their green spaces, they felt proud of their buildings, they felt proud of their communities. And we were working with them to understand what that really meant at the hyperlocal. And I think the most relevant thing that we came from that project to this particular summit is the distinction between, is the distinction between what the literature terms as authentic pride, which is pride in an achievement, which is pride in learning, which is pride that can be sustained, and hubristic pride, which is the pride that we get when someone else thinks we're great. Pride can be a relational emotion. We like to be looked at. That makes us feel pride. As a community, we want other communities to look at us. So if I think about that in terms of buildings, I think of two models. So if I think about authentic pride, I think about the people of Darlington. Darlington was one of our case studies, and they were very proud of their library because the people, the Pease family, the kind of, philanthropists who played a long part of Darlington's history, gave the library to the people of Darlington, and it was their library. It didn't matter whether they went in that library, they liked looking at that library, and they liked that it was theirs. They had ownership of that library. Then another really, really different example of another way in which a building made a community feel something, which is really, really different. It was about the hyperlocal, about one ward in Southampton that was outside. It didn't identify with the City of Culture bid was happening. It didn't identify with those things at all because no one went to Harefield, no one went to their place. The only thing people went to go to Harefield was to their fish and chip shop. So the fish and chip shop was the thing that made them feel pride. So we had really different kinds of emotions connected to different kinds of buildings. And I think thinking about those and the way in which community had ownership of those buildings in really different ways and what that meant was important to those emotional responses.
Thank you very much, Nicky. Abby.
Thank you. So I'm actually currently seconded to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and I'm a Professor of Cultural Policy, which most people won't know what that actually is, and a social scientist by background. And so I'm coming at this really not necessarily in relation to emotion or how we might measure it, but more in terms of referring to research that I've done on participation. So the interest of the DCMS is to increase the participation in arts and culture for the public and to find ways of doing that, and also to make the case to government for why we should do that, why we should have spaces and places and buildings for culture. And I just wanted to go back to some research that I was involved in, which was looking at everyday participation and how people attach the value of their cultural participation to everyday lives and where they did it. A bit like the research that Nicky was talking about, we also tracked where people went around their places, how they felt about that, and whether they didn't go to some places. And what became very clear in this research was that public parks were very, very important to people. We all know the benefits, and they're measured in all kinds of ways of green spaces. You know, they're valuable to property prices, they're valuable to people's well-being, and so on and so forth. And so my work started to look a little bit more at public parks as places where all kinds of participation could happen, and then started to look at the buildings within them. So like the Darlington Library, a lot of parks and their making happened through philanthropic giving, as did those civic institutions, the kinds that had the sort of ornate facades that Thomas was referring to earlier, that sometimes were a display of wealth, rather than necessarily just care for the working class or the poor of the cities where these civic institutions were built. And one example I was thinking of when we were listening earlier was of the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, which is in the middle of a fine municipal public park. The Whitworth is owned by the university, and it's kind of one of those scary red brick Victorian buildings, and it's not necessarily engaged with that much by the local community. So 10 years ago, it had a capital development project which extended its cafe and created a garden around it into the park. And it created a contact zone that was encouraging people to come in to the gallery and to spend time there. It's free, it's a public art gallery. It's got beautiful collections. However, I did some research about 5 years after that and found that still people who go and visit the park didn't know what that building was. They didn't know that it was free to enter, and they didn't know how to get pleasure out of it. And that's something that we might call threshold anxiety. It's something that where museums and buildings, my ex-colleague Helen Rees-Leahy has written about this. Museums and buildings sometimes can control your participation. They may not be to your taste or to your values, and they may not just be for the likes of the people in the park. They may not be of interest. So there's kind of that's partly that disconnect, but it's also partly to signal that actually going over the threshold into buildings might be part of how you feel about them and their existence.
Perfect, thank you. So we've had conventionally positive, but maybe not positive emotions, and pride and the complexity of that. We've got threshold anxiety, but across both of those is the importance of ownership. But I think when we talk about emotions, we can often fix them in time and in place. So what we want to move to now is not just how our buildings influence our feelings in the here and now, but how that might change and become dynamic and differ over time and between people. And so to start with that, I'm going to come back to Nicky, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah? You're a professional at that. Anyway, these two notions of pride, the other thing that we discovered, and that other researchers have found the same thing, is they have quite different kinds of temporality. So this notion of hubristic pride, the pride of being looked at, the problem with that as a form of pride is when you're not looked at, it can turn to other kinds of emotions. So we have competitive placemaking in this country. Lots of funding is awarded by things like the City of Culture, and often that's a competition in which you have to prove how bad you are in order to get money to prove how good you are. It's quite a complicated thing. It asks communities to feel quite negative emotions in order that they can move to positive emotions. I was involved in one bid, I'm not going to name the city, although I'm from that city, so if you look at my biography, there it is, in which we said, one of the really good things here is we're one of the most oppressed places in the country. And so you're asked to feel those things. And so in order to, the thing with hubristic pride, you have this pride of being looked at. Once you think you're not being looked at, it turns into other kinds of emotions. It can be short-lived, and it can often be attendant on shame. It's a relational pride. So it's a relational feeling. So when you're not feeling that, there's other negative feelings there. Whereas we think that authentic pride can be perhaps more long-lived. And we can think about the temporality of that. When pride is attached to achievement, tied rather than being looked at, when pride is attached to longevity, to ownership, to a sense of investment in a place, that seems in our research to have a kind of longer relationship. And we can think the same kinds of things are around well-being as well, well-being as an emotion. So we can think about eudaimonic well-being, which is about achievement, which is about learning, as opposed to kind of hedonic well-being, which is about pleasure and can be shorter-lived. So we think, again, it comes back to this sense of a community's engagement in that place, and its sense of ownership and belonging is important to the longevity of these feelings.
Abby.
So two things that are connected. One is, the current government and the Secretary of State, for them, culture is all about telling stories. And also their priority is to make sure that people whose stories are not normally heard are heard, and so hence the kind of trying to get culture to the places that are seen not to have it. And some of the work that I'm doing there with the DCMS is looking at how we might sort of benchmark the kind of cultural infrastructure, the spaces and places that places need in order for people to have a parity of outcome. And the kind of measures that the government use are phenomenally complex, mainly quantitative, and I'll say a little bit more about them perhaps later in terms of how we might assess value. But I wanted to go back to that idea about narratives. In the research I mentioned before about everyday participation, we kind of followed people's narratives through their everyday lives. And they, one of the things we found out was, people and I know that placemakers are they're very familiar with this sort of understanding, but people journey around places. They go past buildings, and they will go to places that fit in with their contours of their everyday lives. So we found that there was increased library use for places where you could go shopping and you could go and do something else, or you could go to the leisure centre or be opposite a park, and that's called trip chaining in that kind of common idea. So thinking about the stories of people's everyday lives and the meaning of those different places and those buildings and where they are located, the context for that, I think, is absolutely essential to the questions that we're asking today.
Jim?
Thanks, Rebecca. As a Scot, I think I have a complex relationship with the pride emotion. Just get that out there. But I'm going to tie this back again to that sense of ownership, that sense of places being rooted in the user. So, you're talking about competitive bids, and any new school or hospital or any other public building engenders a sense of pride, but it dissipates quickly when the expectation raised is not fulfilled by that investment. And it's especially true in the public domain. So what we see in terms of the way, so to move it away from pride onto something that I feel much safer with, places that evoke positive responses over time, that are used well, that are talked about, that I guess exhibit pride, but not using the P word, are those places that I referred to in my earlier remarks to the first question, places where that sense of belonging is the function of deep engagement with the communities that property serves, that the design responses understand those and are seen and understood by those who will use them. And where you get that happening, you see those kind of qualities that a lot of people have talked about so far this morning, persisting. And it's really tricky one because everyone likes something new, something that's kind of theirs. But if it's not truly theirs in the sense of it's been designed around their needs, I suspect those conflicting emotions become a bit of an issue. And again, without the research necessarily to kind of really kind of back this up, I see that in our practice, and I see its absence in other areas where that practice is lacking.
Thank you. So we're going to come to the final question, which I guess is the kind of $1 million question, right? Which is, we've talked about different kinds of emotions. Different pride can have different levels of emotion. We talk about threshold anxiety, we talk about joy. And these are all hopefully positive things that we want to build into the future of building design and placemaking. So I guess the question really is, how do we do this? So how do we make sure that the emotional responses that we're wanting to engender and nurture in the built environment aren't just fleeting and are actually something that can transfer over? I think it's a 1,000-year rule. How do we make sure that these buildings can last in ways that respond to different kinds of responses, emotional responses, in ways that give us that sense of belonging and that sense of attachment? So the final question, and I'm going to start with Abby on this one, is how do we take this knowledge that comes from stories, that comes from listening to people, and build it into design practices, build it into clients' briefs, build it into local place planning? How do we do this? We don't have to solve it now, but we can start.
No, I'm going to. No, I'm not actually. I'm going to talk again from the kind of the formal sort of policy perspective in terms of national policy and how you might demonstrate that you are providing value for money and returns on investment. And that's basically how government works, right? So we have a lot of public money in the Treasury, and then it gets distributed. And so the kinds of evidence that are required to demonstrate that it's worth investing in culture, particularly in these desperate left behind places who have infrastructure, they have bricks and mortar, they have libraries and museums, many of which were built to calm and contain the poor, particularly in the industrial north where I'm working, but are now crumbling, and they are the ones that are being supported by their local authorities who are struggling. I noted earlier that I think it was Frank said about we really need those measures and for understanding the importance, the value of having a human perspective for design and for the built environment at times of austerity. Yes, we do, but sometimes they're just not enough. So the government has a lot of ways of measuring value, but one of the key ways to do is to turn it into a monetizable value. And there are kind of complex formula that you can use to, for example, understand the subjective well-being of being made happy by going and participating in the arts. And then you can somehow quantify that through a formula, a little bit like our neuroscience earlier, that might then have some money attached to it. There's a piece of work going on at the moment that the DCMS are leading, which is called the Culture and Heritage Framework, which is thinking about things kind of infrastructurally in a way in terms of culture as services and stocks, not just bricks and mortar, but is attaching capitals to all of those values. So a heritage building or a heritage experience might have a kind of capital value to it. So that's the sort of problem-solving answer in terms of government. That's how you prove that. But I think there's still that value in, you know, the humanities answer, the narrative, the stories, the feeling of belonging, the what do we do in these spaces, and how do we have debate? How do we belong to society? How do we belong to a cultural public sphere? Not just how do we show that we are providing some kind of return on investment.
Thank you. Nicky.
I think there's a sort of space as well when we're thinking about community engagement to think about the way in which lived experience is rising up the policy agenda. So sometimes lived experience is going to get kind of sucked into these algorithms when we're thinking about the heritage and capital framework. But in other ways, when we're working with local authorities, for example, they're really keen to understand lived experience and to understand place in the ways in which I don't think they were when I started this work about 5 years ago. There's a different kind of attitude to it. And one of the things that's making local authorities think this is that A, they want to make sure they're spending their money well, but B, they actually have enormous amounts of qualitative evidence around them the whole time, because they have open box surveys, they have people going on doorsteps, they have people writing letters to them. They actually have enormous amounts of information around how their communities feel now. And I think what we're doing, and lots of other organisations are doing at the same time, is trying to help them understand how they can start to organise this data. It's not that they don't have this lived experience, it's that they're not quite sure yet how we can organise qualitative data. It's quite expensive, it takes quite a lot of time, but there are methodologies that we can work with and platforms that we can work with, and I think that's quite an exciting space at the moment to bring them into policy making, to bring affect and emotion into policy making. I think is starting to happen.
And Jim.
Yeah, I suppose there's three things. And for me, there's kind of engagement tools, there's the systems they work within, and then there's culture. So very quickly, we work with colleagues in Public Health Scotland and the Scottish Government to develop the Place Standard tool, which is one of a suite of tools that we use to engage a complete diversity of community interest in their place. So you can go online, Google it, and you'll see how it tries to capture the different aspects of a place, and it's used to layer up across all those diverse communities a sense of what matters to whom, where, when, and you get this incredible richness. So that's really key, finding effective engagement tools so that you can gather as much information as possible to inform what you do next. There's then what you do with that in terms of systems, because one of the difficulties with good tools is that they only work when they're used in a process. And if we just gather that information and don't do anything with it, then it just frustrates people. So making sure that decision makers particularly understand the value of what they're doing and how to realize that. So again, very briefly, the public sector, probably all sectors, are time short and cash starved, and demands are being made on them. So the temptation is to do stuff quickly, whether or not it's the right thing to do. And what we find is that, referencing some of the work I've talked about, is that if you can show people that actually if you just take a little bit of time at the start and get things right, you're going to do things quicker and cheaper and better. The only problem with that in a political environment, I have to say, is that no politician believes that. So there's something for us all to work on in terms of the win-win. But it's true, and there's lots of evidence and increasing evidence of that. And what that then drives, if it all works, is a culture change, and a culture which values design and what design can bring in its deepest, richest sense. And not to drop a clanging note, it's not all about the surfaces. It's about the full three-dimensional, emotional, four-dimensional, however many dimensions there are, but it's about the full thing. If you can get people to understand the full value of design for the users, for the financiers, for the public at large, etc., then persuading people to take a little bit longer, persuading people to do things in the right way becomes much easier. I'm still in a job because that's a piece of work to be done, but I'd like to think that events like today and opportunities like this help to kind of just connect across different sectors in order to get that message.
Thank you. And I just wanted to finish really by adding one thing, which is that a number of us in the audience maybe are involved in education in some way. And I think there was a question earlier. And we talk a lot about research, but actually what we try and do within a university context is research-led teaching. And so at the University of Glasgow, we teach Royal Town Planning Institute accredited planners. We teach real estate with RICS, housing with CIH. So actually, it's not just about convincing or joining the public conversation with people who are already in professions. And it's also very difficult, I think, to sit back and say, well, why aren't you doing this if you've not been given the skills and training and capacity to be able to do it? So I think that public conversation also comes back to people who are in education and who's setting those professional standards in professional membership organisations to say, how do we equip the next generation of professionals to be thinking about this? And then how does that affect us as researchers? Ask the right kinds of questions. So I think there is a kind of temporal dimension really in thinking about the next generation and how we might be able to do that collectively within our education, within our CPD and within our professional competencies. So I think we're just about on time. So I'm going to open it up for a couple of questions, comments and thoughts. I can see one at the back over there. Thank you.
Hi there. My name's Robin Lando. I'm the co-founder of Kinda Studios. We're a neuroscience studio and lab. We translate neuroscience research around how we experience our environments into creative projects. And I was just wondering, like, in the last panel and this one is so, highly connected. And I was just wondering, in the way of measurement, I feel like there's still a disconnect between how we measure and the kind of affect that people feel in their bodies and towards spaces. And obviously Heatherwick just did a great project around this. But what would you like to see in terms of like making change for policy and culture? How do we think we need to use those measures to translate that, of course, into kind of the economic impact? But also I was wondering what you think is needed from an experiential perspective for people to understand how their emotions kind of interplay here. We use a lot of neurotechnology in our lab in these real world environments to do so. And I was just wondering what you kind of feel is needed to help drive that change forward to close the gaps.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the really important things when you're asking a community how they feel about something is that they get to set the measurements, actually, that kind of notion of co-production, the co-production of what's going to be important here, and then how do we measure it. So I think that's one of the important things. So, for example, when we were trying to measure pride for different kinds of communities, we worked with those communities to say, okay, what's the best methodology to understand it? So when we worked with Ledbury Poetry Festival to understand how people felt pride in volunteering, we used poetry as our methodology there. So I think there's different kinds of creative methodologies, but I think co-production is really important for both setting out what's the most appropriate methodology and for setting out actually what are the most appropriate metrics, because we don't know always what that community wants us to measure. And I think the hyperlocal can be really important here, and that's a difficult thing in a policy context to think even below the level of award, but that's actually where feelings reside in our research.
Good question. I think there are different types of measurements for different types of purposes, for different types of audiences, and I suppose that's something that we could think about today, is who is this campaign targeting? What kind of evidence, do we actually need? And do we take that and parcel it up for different stakeholder audiences? Certainly, for government, they need to know its value for money, and they need to be accountable for that. It's right that they actually do that. But if you are looking at how you plan together with communities, places, and how you make sure that they feel involved and they feel they belong there, then you're going to use things that are more processual, and you're going to try to develop. And sometimes the research and the evaluation is part of the process of developing that relationship. So cultural planning methodologies are also about looking at what's there in the first place. What's there? What's going to stop something else being built? in whose interest does building this thing lie, and who can and can't participate in it. And that would be my kind of understanding of place and places as made up, just not just of buildings that are dotted around in a built environment, but as messy as thrown together with all kinds of attachments, memories, values, that are all there and that are driven by the people that are living and working and visiting those places. So, it's a complex situation to try to just value and package up. And that's why we do need, narratives, and we do need to have an understanding of, what's there, what's lost if something else takes its place, in terms of their impact.
I don't have an answer to the first part of the question, but I would dearly like there to be one. In Scotland, we have a government that has a set of overarching national outcomes that all public bodies, including my own, are expected to contribute to. And amongst those outcomes, I can't recite them all, but again, you can look them up online, are things like happiness and well-being. And what that means is that organisations like mine, but organisations like the SQA that deals with qualifications at school and further education level, et cetera, et cetera. So from all sectors have to align their work in order to deliver on those outcomes. So where I'm going with this is that on the projects that I do know about, and where I am able to show how there are wider benefits than just the very narrow Green Book Treasury style metrics that public projects often get filtered through. It shows what the true cost and value of a project is. If we can cleave onto those additional metrics around things like happiness and well-being, then in my view, that can only enhance the case for the sorts of approaches and the sorts of values that we've been talking about today.
Thank you. I've got a lot of hands. I'm going to go right at the back, then at the front, and then at the front. So if we have time, which we might not.
Hi, my name's Michelle Martin. I'm an architect. I run a practice, but we also run a community interest company providing heritage craft skills in existing buildings. And when you were talking about society change, the pride of a place, I'd like to hear your thoughts in regards to, do you think the lack of the contribution affects the people's connection of the ownership of the place with pride, such as the actual craft of the building? So where I'm from Yorkshire as well, and in a very small area, and everybody knows, like, oh, my great-great-granddad built that church, or so-and-so was a stonemason, and all of these different heritage craft skills that we had, which then built the kind of style, the vernacular of the heritage buildings of the architecture. And as we start progressing into this, as you call it, shittiness, and the lack of, not saying that there isn't any skill there, because there is, but the lack of craft skill that we recognise with these particular types of details, and the ownership that people within your community had. Do you think that affects that connection to a place and understanding of your existing buildings in a space, essentially?
You know what I'm going to say, don't you? It's not really a question, is it? Yes. I mean, I think that we know that Historic England, I saw someone from Historic England here today, Historic England have done work on how proud people feel of their industrial heritage. That the notion of heritage doesn't have to just be kind of, beautiful buildings. It can be absolutely labour and the history of work in the place and their connection to that history of work. So I think there is research. I haven't done that research, but there is research demonstrating that. And I think absolutely that sense of investment, that sense of being in a place and being able to trace those relationships are really, really important. Yeah.
It's another aspect of ownership, and I think it's really important. My forebearers were Clydeside ship workers, in part. They're still proud, well, actually they aren't, because most of them are dead, but their children and their children's children are still proud proud of things that are at the bottom of oceans and haven't been seen for decades because they've all been blown up or sunk or something like that. But that is tangible still, that sense of this was a community that did something quite extraordinary, world kind of renowned and so forth. And it's just another aspect of ownership. So the dislocation that has happened in lots of aspects, like we talked earlier about food production and so forth. Individual citizens are increasingly detached from the things that service their lives, and the built environment is no different. And if you reflect on the cost of that in relation to what you're talking about, maybe that starts to talk to the answer as well.
Just very briefly, I think, absolutely, and it's also thinking about paying it forward, isn't it? A colleague of mine is doing some work in Southport where he's trying to support a creative community of practice in place in a disused shopping arcade. So he's reinvigorating and reanimating that space by bringing people together. And one of the key things he wants to do is to make sure that there are heritage craft skills in Southport, that there's an education, as Rebecca was saying, there's an educational aspect to that, so that people will stay connected to their place and they may be building or conserving and renovating the buildings of the future.
Okay, I think we've just got 2 minutes left, so can I ask you to take very, very quick questions and very, very quick answers, so just at the front here.
Hi, I feel like a very lucky imposter in that I'm actually working in the medical field in accident and emergency and urgent care, and so essentially a design and artistic desert. And my question is, how do we solve the disconnect between the creative minds, the research, to the on the ground, what's happening? So there's lots of really good evidence that just isn't being implemented, and it would only take very small moves, but you can't get through the bureaucracy or the busyness or the financial constraints, despite the fact the money gets thrown at completely wasteful stuff. Simple things like in a big measure in A&E is about people getting on top of pain. Now, it's known, very, very widely known, that putting plants in the waiting room reduces your pain score by 2 points. And you're really happy if you can get somebody medicine and it reduces that. So instead of putting plants in the waiting room, the pressure is put on the staff for another achievable that they just can't achieve. And the really simple things are just so frustrating.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. The very short answer is come to Scotland and I'll show you how it can be done.
Brilliant. You're on.
But there is a longer answer which actually addresses exactly what you've talked about and so much more. So our work within the Scottish Health Service is designed to anticipate all of those sorts of issues and manage them in a much more creative and positive way. And the benefits are not just the wonderful outcomes for service users, those who work in the buildings, but also those who unfortunately have to visit them, etc., etc. It gives a return on the public pound as well.
So who drives that? How do you get the first step?
I'll come and talk to you later.
Okay.
But it's all on our website.
I'm very sorry, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But just if you would join me in thanking the panel and thanking yourselves for the questions again.